on our second class on applying the gospel to outrage. So let me kind of explain a little bit of the setup as Jan and I were kind of talking together about what the forum would look like and how to get into it in a way that's productive rather than not productive. So we wanted to do a little more reviewing of what's helpful for constructive disagreements and discussions, so that we set it up well. We want to kind of wade in very carefully. So the last 10 minutes or so of this time, we'll start the forum conversation stuff. Now, what we'll do is we'll ask you to, because the folks that are watching this from their homes, they couldn't hear some of the questions, so we will ask you to speak into the mics so that people can hear you, and if you think you can yell loud enough for people online to hear you, they can't. So don't try it. It doesn't work. Trust us on this one. Okay? All right. So let me begin with a word of prayer, and then we're going to start, and then we're going to kind of start wading into the whole forum conversation, and as it goes, hopefully well, then our next time will be more of a full forum conversation. All right, let's pray. So, Father, I pray that you would bless this time, that we'd find it to be fruitful. It would give us some of the tools we need. It would help us as Christians to do a good job of representing you, even in the midst of disagreements and conversations, that our viewpoint doesn't override the relationship that we want to have. And so I pray that we would always value that first, and your honor first, and then after that we engage in a way that is persuasive and not destructive. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so some review, and you'll please forgive me for that, and I'm going to have Jan come up and talk a little more about some other things that we kind of added in as other helpful habits. So, again, a review of the gospel very, very quickly. It is the gospel of reconciliation, among other things. In 2 Corinthians, we're told it's a ministry of reconciliation, primarily reconciliation between God and people, or people to God, but also with people to people. Okay? So if God began this world with humans in perfect relationship with Him and one another, because that's where we start the whole Bible story, is in the garden. We don't start the gospel in Matthew or even Romans chapter 1. We start it in Genesis 1, where everything's set. And there are perfect relationships with Him and others. And if the curse fractured these relationships, which we know is true, because once we get past Genesis 2 into Genesis 3, I mean, what's the first result once sin has been done? They hear God coming, and what do? They hide. They hide. Is that a sign of a good relationship? I know that was the Daniel fell in the blank den. Anyone? You know, lion. Anyway, yeah. And then, of course, when God starts asking questions, Adam points to Eve, and he accuses her, and Eve accuses the serpent, and the serpent says, "Well, okay." But fractured relationships are part of the curse. If the cross, and resurrection satisfied the holy wrath of God, redeemed us from enslavement, reconciled us to God and others, and if the gospel, and I think this is very important to always, always, always understand, if the gospel teaches us that other people are not the enemy, that Satan is, and if you're wondering what other people aren't, I referenced Ephesians 6:12, and maybe we should just look at it very, very quickly, just to make sure I'm not making stuff up. It says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood," that'd be other people, "but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." One of the things that has helped me as I've talked with people who I disagree with strongly, and whether they're Christians or not Christians, whether they're a brother or sister in Christ or whether they are not, is they're not the enemy. Satan is. So why would I treat them like the enemy, even if they might think I am? Then then, and this is the part where I'd like to ask you to fill in the blank, and I'll repeat some of your answers for folks that are online. If these things are all true, we should be blank when it comes to discussions and even disagreements. Maybe some folks fill in the blank for me. If these things are all true, we should be blank when having discussions and disagreements. Gracious. Meaning we bestow favor irregardless of whether they deserve it, merit it, right. Gracious. Anything else? Kind. Why do you say kind? Because it's better than being unkind. These are the kind of deep insights that I usually offer.
It really demonstrates the love of Christ in us towards others and His kindness to us, and we're supposed to emulate His kindness, and it's also a fruit of the Spirit.
Right. Kindness is, I'm repeating, but kindness is a demonstration of love. It's a demonstration of the fruit of the Spirit. It's one of the most underrated of the virtues, I would say. We usually don't run to kindness quite right away. Usually we run to either the opposite of our vice, like patience or love or something like that. But kindness is huge. Any other blank things you'd fill that blank in before we continue? Wise. We should be wise when it comes to discussions. Why do you say wise?
We need to be aware of what's going on. They probably can't hear me on the video.
I'm going to repeat it though. They need to be aware of what's going on. If you're talking to somebody, you need to be aware that maybe you don't know everything that's going on. Maybe they had a terrible encounter in their childhood or even recently that has really skewed them. And maybe they're very upset and you're not really arguing with a person. You're arguing with something that happened in their life. And they're taking it very, very personally. And wisdom would say, you know what, I got to kind of think about this for a little bit. It is a question I've asked of a lot of people that I've talked to who are atheists. And one of the questions I have, especially if they get particularly angry, I'll say, hey, I want to slow this down. I don't mean to make you mad. I'm not trying to anger you or cause a fight. I'm just curious, did somebody who was representing religion or Christianity ever do something to you? And 9 times out of 10, yeah, well, I'd like to hear about it. It's very disarming, by the way. It helps them go, hey, I am so sorry that happened to you. That was terrible. And even if you didn't get an apology from them, whether it counts or not, I apologize on their behalf. Yeah, wise. I like that. Very good. With that, let me review some of the bad habits for communication. Misinterpretation. Misinterpretation is when somebody says something to you and you misinterpret it. Right? Like when I was giving poor Natalie Smith the whatnot last week, right? Poor Natalie, she was and she says, hey, I'd like for you to help out a little more on that. Oh, so I don't do anything. She didn't say that, but I misinterpreted it. Or, oh, you do everything around here. That's the opposite of the misinterpretation, but it's still a misinterpretation. And of course, the solution to that is of course seeking an accurate interpretation, right? And it's real easy. You say, I think I hear you saying this, but correct me if I'm wrong. No, that's not what I'm saying. Or yes, that's what I'm saying. Okay, just making sure. Or invalidation. That is going immediately to labeling people, or worse, calling people names, right? Well, I think this. Well, that makes you a sadist. That makes you a racist. That makes you a bigot. That makes you whatever. I mean, you might as well not even have a conversation. We've now deemed that you are evil. Why have a conversation with you? You know, and it's been done to people in this room. I mean, how many people has that been done to? Only one of you? 2 of you have ever been invalidated by somebody? All right, I'll do some invalidating later on today. I'll call you all names or something. I'll think of something. Don't worry. Anyway, I'm sure it's happened to more of you than that. And truth be told, I know that I have caught myself invalidating other people as well, immediately putting them into a category without ever, and therefore disposing of them as having a valid argument. To my shame. To my shame. And of course, the answer to that is refusing labels. Third one is listening to reload. You remember that one, right? Especially you and your spouse, if you're married, you probably run into this. Well, let me go back through all the points that you made and just rifle them right back down, because I'm not really listening to what you're trying to say to me. What I'm doing is I'm listening to you so I can just counter you. Not that we don't have back and forth and countering, not that you just accept everything somebody says to you, of course not. But if all you're doing is listening to reload with your counter arguments and then come back with your arguments, that's not listening. And it's not productive. So listening to understand. Filibustering, we all know what that is. Poor Natalie, once again, was the victim of my filibustering attack, where I just talk right over. You know, that moment where you're looking for the break, or when the person takes a breath, so you can jump in with your comments, grab the mic and say, I'm not giving this back. And you just lecture. Who likes that? No hands. Not that you're a bunch of hand raisers, but no, nobody would like that. So conversing, not lecturing. You know, when I see this in marital counseling, when a couple comes in and they're struggling, and I'm watching it happen in front of me, I pull out my stapler. You've probably seen this before. And I hand it to the first person. I tell the other person, while they're holding the stapler, you're not allowed to talk. However, when you want to make a point, you raise your hand, and that means that person has to wrap it up and hand you the stapler, and then it reverses. And it's just a little object lesson that kind of helps people go, I'm filibustering. I'm not conversing. I'm not letting the other person have their say. And this is one of those little exercises. Well, we use those in the debates, not a stapler, but maybe. What we do have, I will tell you this. I'm sorry, say that again. Huh? Oh, yeah. Well, they turned off mics is what they did. So Jan and I, when we get into the forum, we're going to ease in today and then hopefully more next week. We're going to throw, we didn't have yellow flags, so we have orange scrunchies, I guess. So if you commit a foul, we're going to throw the scrunchie at you. That was as pathetic a throw. Sad. Anyway, don't mock me. I'm very tender about that. Finally, escalation. And that's where you're just like, you're just one-upping. And again, the illustration from, not that, all these things happen in marriage, but in a marriage, when you see, when escalation is happening, one of your spouses sticks her tongue out, or, as my wife has done to me before, like, that was her signal to go, to make me giggle a little bit and to bring it down a little bit. It was a symbol to say, hey, let's de-escalate. And if I pick up on the sign, I go, yeah, you're right. Let's bring it down a notch or two. So that those are some of the reviewing of some of the communication habits. I'm going to have Jan come up here, and if you grab a mic over there, so you've got a mic for yourself. We'll kind of talk together about some of these points, but I wanted to make sure that we went over that. Did everybody get the and did everybody get the article that Jan thought was a good article? And she even has some visuals on there as well that she liked, and we put those in there too. But Jan, we were talking about 7 more good habits to be redemptive when we disagree.
Right.
And we'll kind of go back and forth and tell us a little bit about the other 7.
Okay, so we're, if you're following the notes, we're on section 4 right now, right?
Correct.
Okay. Am I on? I can't hear myself.
You are on.
Okay. All right. So in the article that we copied for you, by the way, just so you're aware, we do have a resource list available. There are several books that we are recommending that you might want to take a look at, and I think we're going to have that available maybe next week.
I forgot to put it in.
Dave forgot to put it on your list this week.
It was supposed to be in this week.
I forgive you, Dave.
Thank you.
Okay.
So what you're saying is I don't do my job. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. No, I'm kidding.
Ouch.
There are also, for those of you, not everybody likes to read the way I like to read, but if you're interested in the topic, I also have a list of about 10 or 11 articles all related to this area. And so if you're interested, let us know, and we'll make sure that you get a list. And we'll definitely make sure everybody gets a list of of the books next time. So last time we concentrated or looked at sort of negative or unproductive communication skills when it comes to having these kinds of conversations. So today we want to focus on what are some productive ways of engaging others when there's a political disagreement. So if you look at your outline, first of all, looking for common ground. So when someone makes a comment, particularly about something that you feel very emotional about, something political, your first reaction is what if you disagree with them?
One more time.
Be defensive.
Defensive, yes.
Right. And as part of being defensive, what is it that you want to respond to them with? Or how? Your opinion, right?
Yeah.
So, so a lot of these overlap that we're going to be talking about, and I want us to be aware that this is a process, and there's a lot of overlapping in our responses. So it's really important to be aware of how this dynamic works. So when you are defensive, you're already looking for some sort of a rebuttal, right? What if you were to instead listen to the other person, try to feel them out and have them really talk to you about why they feel the way they feel, and look for some common ground, some unity? So how do we do that? What is one of the ways that you think we can look for common ground with somebody? Can you speak up a little?
Learn to discern.
Learn to discern, okay.
Yeah. Lisa, you had your hand up too? Ask questions.
Perfect.
Okay.
Asking questions. And one of the best ways to do that is to just say, I'm really curious as to, how you came about, how did you get to that conclusion? Or what is it that you think about that has made you reach that conclusion or that idea or that value that you have? So really being curious, being sort of putting on your therapist hat and scratching your head a little bit. I always tell people, pretend you're Columbo. He always used to scratch his head and say, oh, I don't understand that. And he sort of disarmed people because he took a one-down position. I really don't understand that. Can you explain how you got to that? And what you might find is that you two that there are some common grounds. For instance, if we look at healthcare, some people want a one-party healthcare system. Some people want private enterprise to do it. But what would be a common ground between those two people? We all want healthcare.
We all want healthcare. We all want good healthcare.
So you want to look at what do we have in common and try to find a kernel of unity that you can begin. And that increases, first of all, the other person's engagement with you, and it might even reduce your defensiveness a little bit if you can find that. We already talked about being open, kind, and gracious. And sometimes you have to sort of breathe deeply and catch your breath and remember who we're representing when we're in these kinds of conversations, especially today with things being as emotional as they are and people feeling as strongly about whatever end of the spectrum they happen to be on. Keep calm, especially as tensions arise. So what happens to you physically when you start to get agitated?
Blood pressure rises, turn red. I know I'm repeating, but I'm doing it for the. Yeah.
Talk louder.
There's like there's a physical aspect to it, isn't there? Mm-hmm.
You also start talking faster because you really want to get your thoughts out there. You want the other person to hear what you're saying. Those are just a few of the physical things that happen. But if you can be aware of that, once you're aware that, wow, I'm starting to talk more pressured, I'm starting to breathe deeper, try to just take a break and take a deep breath and calm it down. One of the things in couples counseling that we talk about is how when conversations escalate, they get louder, they talk faster, and they're kind of talking over each other. To just, if you can be the person, even if the other person is escalating, if you can be the person to start talking slower, to start talking in a not as loud of a voice, that can really help to sort of de-escalate the other person because they no longer have to fight for your attention.
Do you ever go into a conversation knowing that you have to stay calm and do something prep-wise? Like Serenity Now?
Serenity
Something
Now.
like that?
Yes, personally and professionally that has happened, yes. And that's about all I'm going to...
It's about me, isn't it? Okay, fine.
No comment.
Just say it, Jan.
I'm breathing deeply,
Bill, could you?
and I'm talking softer and slower.
What's that supposed to mean? Anyway, go ahead.
Okay. This next one is really important too. Having a conversational goal. When we engage in political discourse, particularly during these times, what tends to be your goal when you are arguing your values with somebody? You want to win, exactly. What's that?
Pride comes in the picture
Pride.
real quick.
Absolutely, pride does. And if my goal is I am going to convince you that you are totally wrong and I am totally right, chances are very good that in this particular climate anyway, and probably all the time or most of the time, you're not going to reach that goal. What if you had the goal of, I want to be able to really understand why you think the way you do because I don't understand that. It's not a value that I hold or it's not a conclusion that I would reach, but I want to understand how you got to that. How would you react differently?
I think you'd be listening more instead of trying to put your own opinion across.
Right. Listening more and not trying to push your opinion across. Absolutely.
Lisa, in fact, emailed me. Can I put you on the spot, Lisa? Sure. So she emailed me last week and she said, is it okay to ever ask somebody, what are your goals for this conversation? Right in the middle of it, like, as it's getting heated, it's like, let's figure out, are you just trying to make me bend to your will, or are you just passionate about this? Or, yeah, I mean, and it was a great comment, by the way, Lisa. And so I said, you should ask it, but I just made you ask it by repeating you. But but yeah, I mean, even asking it right in the middle of the conversation. Hey, what is your goal about this?
Exactly. Exactly. And be willing to accept the fact that the other person may not get to where you are and probably, most likely won't, at least not with one conversation. So letting up a little bit and just wanting to be heard. We had mentioned last week about, wanting the other person to truly understand what's going on in your mind, but also wanting to truly understand this other person and what's going on in their mind and why they reached the conclusion that they reached. The next one is accepting that you may not change someone's mind and valuing the relationship anyway. So how many of you have had a situation where you've disagreed with somebody, maybe on one of these current events, and walked away and felt like the relationship has suffered? Some of you have raised your hands, and it's so easy to get to that point. And without, having as one of our goals, I want to maintain a positive relationship. I want to engage with this person. I don't want to walk away where we have damage that we have to repair somewhere down the road. I want us to end this conversation without having, that burden on either one of us. So remember, the relationship is important. I don't always agree with everything my husband says, believe it or not, and he doesn't always agree with everything I say, but in the end, we care about each other enough to say, we don't have to. We can agree to disagree. Okay, let's see, what's the next one here? Oh, disagreeing with someone you care about is okay. Somehow we have it, some of us have it in our minds that if we care about you, if we like each other, we have to agree on these big issues. I think some of the little things we can kind of let go of, but because we're living in a society where there's so much polarization and there's so much emotion on either side of the spectrum, we feel like, well, it's not okay to disagree. Somehow we have to, we have to agree, we have to reach some level of agreement, and that's not going to be the case. Sometimes you have to agree to disagree. And finally, know when to end the conversation. What are some of your thoughts? When do you think it would be appropriate to end a conversation? Or maybe necessary to
And
end?
maybe a follow-up question, how do you end the
Yes,
conversation? Yeah.
exactly. I was getting there, Pastor.
Oh, sorry.
When things are escalating and the other person is getting too wound up, sometimes it's better to just step away if they,
Right. So when things are escalating, if you notice the other person or yourself getting wound up, getting really emotional where you're not, where the communication, the engagement is suffering, it might be a good idea. And so, as Dave asked, so how would you end a conversation like that? What would be some kind, gracious way to end that conversation?
Shut up, moron.
No.
No.
But that was a good try.
Dang it. Stink at this.
Tell
Tell 'em you
them
care
care
about 'em?
them.
Care about them enough that you don't want to continue hurting each other?
Perfect. Perfect.
Value the relationship
Yes.
more than the argument.
Right. And Mark, I think that's excellent to express that out loud. You know, I value this relationship so much that I think for now we should take a break because we're not coming to agreement, and the way that we're talking about this is really, in some ways damaging or at least affecting the quality of our relationship. So I care about you more than that right now. Let's take a break. And sometimes you can say, let's take a break and maybe we can, come back to this and have further discussion. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it might be something you agree, maybe we're just not going to go there. So,
phrase I use is there's no new information here when you're going round and round.
There's no new information here, so
Right.
why are we doing this?
right.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Recognizing those loops that we can get into when we're communicating and we're just not getting anywhere.
Leona?
Also acknowledging the common ground, backing up to that point of here's where we see eye to eye, and, I want to focus on that.
So backing up to the common ground and kind of saying, at least we can agree on these things. But at the end of the conversation, is that how we end it? Do we just say, obviously we can't get any further than this? I mean, since this is the end of the conversation, when do we and how do we end the conversation? But do we kind of end on, we still do have these common grounds and we can land on that one? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay.
I think that's great to leave them with that notion in their head. Well, there were things we agreed on because a lot of times when we have disagreements, what we carry away from it is where we haven't reached agreement. So to express that, and really make that tangible. But you know what? We agree on this and this. And that's a great way to end it.
Let me ask you a question, because there are some people that don't want to end the conversation.
Right.
So, for instance, Leona might end the conversation with, look, I want to end the conversation on the things that we agree with, and we agree on these things, and then the person says, well, obviously we don't agree, and they keep going. How do you end that conversation?
Well, I think what you have to do is... And
Taser?
No, Dave, not taser.
You don't like any of my ideas.
But thanks for the bad idea.
I don't even have a taser.
Even though it's difficult, because there are people sometimes who just can't let go and don't want to feel that it's too ambiguous. If I can't convince you of something, then this wasn't productive. So you have to be a little bit assertive in a loving way, and just keep repeating, you know what? I can see that you still want to talk about this. I can see that it's important to you, and maybe we can come back to this at some time. But right now, I need to take a break because I care about our relationship. I care about our friendship, and I just think it'd be better if we, for now, thought about it and went our separate ways, and we can come back and talk about it in the future.
Do you ever actually say things like, I am really getting upset and I don't want to be here?
You can own that. You can say, and you can explain why. I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling upset because I feel as though this conversation that we're having is so non-productive and so harmful to our relationship that, I need to take a break for my sake as well as for the sake of our relationship.
Good.
And they still might you know, you might have to repeat that. So there's nothing wrong with repetition in a kind, gentle, you know, but assertive way.
Great. So what we're going to do at this point, on the page you'll see there's 3 different topics, but I just made an executive decision to take the first one, since this really is what began this whole thing. Is, you know, the George Floyd incident really incited a lot of questions and concerns about racial issues and racial divisions and things like that. But there's other ones like COVID concerns, like to mask or not to mask. That is the question. Yeah, I'm sorry, doing the Hamlet thing. And but you know, there are a lot of arguments happening about COVID. Maybe not as much about the racial issues, but definitely that. And obviously, the election thing. You know, you've seen people say things like, Christians can't vote for Donald Trump because Christians can't vote for Joe Biden because, I mean, it's like this declaration of you can't do it. If you're a Christian, you can't do this. And boy, you've seen those arguments too, right? However, to keep it on the one that I think is important, especially given the sermon, if you were here first service, you know where I'm going. If you're not, then I just kind of tipped you off. But here's what we'd like to do from here on. I'm going to throw out a question. Please wait. Jan and I are going to go down the floor. We're going to make sure you have a mic. Don't do this while you're talking with a mic, because if you're Italian and you tend to gesture with your hands, nobody can hear you, okay? Put it right here. Even touch your chin. Well, maybe not touch. Well, you got masks on. Don't worry about it. But put it close to your mouth so people can hear you. And we're going to ask a question, and we'd like people from both sides of the aisle to kind of weigh in on it. And what we have are these orange scrunchies. So if you commit a foul, we're going to blow the whistle. We're going to throw the flag or the scrunchie, and we're going to say, you know, hey, okay, what you just did was invalidation, or you're filibustering now, or something like that, okay? We're going to see how this goes. We do want honest conversation, but we want to kind of have these common ground rules, because ultimately we want to make sure that we're playing fair, because ultimately we represent Christ. And if we can't do this in here, then what are the chances of you doing it out there with somebody who doesn't know Christ, right? We'd really like you to be equipped to be able to have thoughtful conversations as opposed to destructive arguments. So, I'm going to bring up this topic, and I would like for people to answer the question, is our country, or is it not, plagued by systemic racism? If you have a comment, I have a mic. So does Jan.
Can you define it first?
Well, that is part of the conversation now, isn't it? I would do it, but somebody might disagree with me on my definition of systemic racism.
The question was, can you define it first? For those of you at home.
No.
No, there's not systemic racism, and you would say, why?
Because I believe that people are being brainwashed to believing that it is.
Okay.
And there's so much more. I can't even
Okay.
go into it.
So you're starting with no, and you feel like somebody is pushing this idea onto us
To change this country.
to change our country, to change our minds. Okay. This doesn't work if nobody has a different opinion.
You know you're going to have these conversations in your private life. Please be bold. Share your thoughts. Thank you for sharing your thought with us.
Let me go back to you and say, do you have a definition for systemic racism?
I'd have to think about it, but I don't think this passed fast.
Tell me your definition of systemic racism, or just give me your rough draft. How's that? We will give you grace in case your definition is not fully formed because you haven't thought about it thoroughly.
Yeah, please give me grace. I guess when I hear systemic racism, I think of ways that certain people, well, I guess if we're saying racism, it's based on their race, are treated differently than other people of other races, not necessarily based on individual choice against that person, but because the society is set up such that everybody doesn't get equal opportunities and equal chances.
Okay.
So I don't consider myself a racist, but I know that there are, I believe, I should say I believe instead of I know, right? That in the city of Milwaukee, for instance, things are set up in certain ways, and I say set up, I think it's just evolved and it is getting better, but not everybody is able to live on the same kind of plane. I'll just throw something out there, and I haven't thought this through,
That's
obviously,
fine.
but
That's fine.
something like healthy foods being available in areas of the city where minorities are concentrated. So that affects their health, which affects their health care. Now, nobody has made a decision, hey, let's discriminate against minority people by not allowing them, by not having fresh food available for them. But it would affect a society moving out unless we make decisions that reverse that.
Okay. Yeah, the food pantry, that organization does, in fact, they did change their policy about healthy food because they saw that as an issue. Yeah. All right, back to Susan.
Yeah, you have to define what's minority. Is it just between black and white? Is it between black and Hispanics? Is it between the rich, the poor? I mean, because I grew up in the city of Milwaukee, and I know what it's like to not have anything or even food sometimes. And so I disagree with what is going on right now. I would say 90%, because we're all prejudiced in some way or another against a small group or whatever, or a person but not because someone is, I'm not prejudiced against anyone that's different than me, okay? But I will become very, I have to say, strongly disliking people that come against me because I am a certain way or a certain color or because I am skinny or because I am fat, So this black and white thing is just going over the top, I think. There's always been somewhat prejudice going on, okay? And it's all over the world. I mean, it's tribal, it's whatever you want to call it, groups of people, So I don't know. I have too much, right now I have too much anger about all of this, about the presidential thing, about COVID. COVID is over the top with me. Mm-hmm. So I consider my mask a slave muzzle.
Okay.
I think we're just all, children have been brainwashed since the 1980s, maybe even before that, to hate America, and they're trying to bring it down, and they're using different things to do that. And the systemic racist is one of them. And the BLM is a cult, and it doesn't care about black lives. What about these poor little black children?
I'm going to throw the flag.
Yeah, throw the flag.
Sorry. I understand your passion and your viewpoint and just the care with which you've expressed it. But I threw the flag because you use the word cult, and that's a label. Okay, now remember that we're talking about if you are engaging with somebody who has a different viewpoint than yours, and they were to hear you use the term cult for Black Lives Matter, what effect would that have on that conversation?
I understand that. That's why I try not to use that. It's a group of people. It's not all the people. They don't even know what they're following. They don't even know what they're following. All you have to do is look it up. And they're proud to say that they do witchcraft and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, that's labeling. You can label all day long. A fact is a fact, okay? They're being blindly led okay? And you got to pray for those people to open their eyes, because they're going to get hurt. They'll get hurt.
Okay. Well, I would also say that I would come from the opposite side in terms of, because Black Lives Matter is a rather large organization, if you read their website, there's some very concerning things on it, but there's a lot of people in it who really are just genuinely concerned about black lives. And I got to get back to the question that was, is there or is there not systemic racism in this country? And I don't want to get off too far off the path. I want to see if we can answer that question. I think Mark has a comment.
Well, being that we came from Southern California and we went through close to 30 years ago, the Rodney King riots and stuff like that, and I actually had customers in some pretty rough areas, and I had conversations with I would say, the manager was black, and it was interesting that the conversation was, she saw things one way, I would voice my way, and I says, none of this stuff gets fixed overnight. I go, this is probably it could take 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe even 100 years when you get into this. What I'm seeing now is, I've never seen more interracial families mixed between all different races, Mexican, white, Chinese, Asian. It's more and more and more. Where I'm finding this systemic racism is, there's some older people on certain sides, and they've got the power, and they want to keep their power, and they keep agitating, and I would say throwing gasoline on it, because that's what they built their whole life on. And they don't want it to end, because if that gets fixed and there is no racism, they cease to exist, and they won't give that up. And to me, I look at people as, I can only do what I do. I'm Mark. Leona is Leona. I can't tell her how she needs to think and do things. So as I see this systemic racism, maybe we're just not enough time yet. But
So you're saying there is systemic racism?
There is some.
And by definition, since we're all kind of working on that, what would your definition be?
That it's going to take time, and there's got to be things that need to filter out. I would say when Moses had was in, for 40 years, the ones that came out of Egypt, that needed to go away, and then the offspring came in and took the place of that. And so I think it needs to be, I guess in time, it needs to be worked out, is how I see some of this racism stuff. We haven't had enough time yet.
Okay.
There is racism, and it's based on biases, whatever that bias may be, and whatever your perception is and where you come from. My concern is the words systemic. Is it truly systemic? Because that leads to the idea that we're all working together to promote racism, and I don't believe that that's true.
So you've
on
given
either side.
So you've given one very, very clear definition of systemic racism. And I think there's two different ways of thinking of it. There's the one that says racism is so infiltrated every aspect of culture. It's all of us and it's everything. It's bled into everything. The other would say that there are systems that promote racism. That doesn't mean that everybody's doing it, but there are systems that have been put into place that actually promote racism. So there's two different definitions. I was trying to kind of get you guys to push a little bit on that particular topic. So would you say systemic racism is the idea that there are systems in place, and somebody of that ilk would say there were Jim Crow laws. That's a systemic racism because it's a system. Or obviously slavery. It's clearly a system. Or, I would even argue that when you have welfare that is incentivizing single-parent families, that is actually systemic racism because it's causing, to the detriment of the poor community, of which many of them are in the black community, being affected by this in a negative way. That would be a system of systemic racism. Would you agree or disagree?
Is that system, though, partially self-imposed?
Well, that's a great question.
Meaning that just the assumption that poor is associated with race and can't be turned around, is that a self-created then system?
Okay. Jerry, you got a comment.
Just talking about a definition of systemic racism, I believe the way it's taught and the way it's being promoted is that it's unconscious. In other words, we don't even have to know we're doing it. We do it. We can't help it. That is exactly why when companies bring in these diversity classes and things, the first thing they have to do is convince people that you are in fact racist, because you will deny that you're not, that you are, but they will insist that you are, because it's systemic, which really makes it a very powerful idea, because there's no way to fight it,
Okay.
even though I personally believe it to be untrue.
Okay. We have just another minute because we're running out of time. Nancy, you have a comment.
I think in the last year I've learned a little more about racism and systemic racism just working on my dissertation. That's not the topic of it, but I touch on that. And I think I would view systemic racism as it's just kind of a part of your everyday life in society, et cetera. And I had a conversation with the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion where I'm going to be doing my research. And he is of Cuban and Puerto Rican descent. And he discriminated against me on the phone because I didn't grow up in the Hispanic community. I'm not fully Hispanic, but I was shocked that he discriminated against me. And I just said, how do you handle racism in your university, just to kind of get information for where I'll be doing my research shortly. And then he was asking me how I was raised, and because I went to Catholic schools and Christian schools, I never went to MPS, he was coming down hard on me. And I thought, oh my goodness, think quickly in the conversation, because I struggled to show him grace, but at the same time I said, you know, there's still racism going on around here. And I said, because I didn't grow up in the South Side Hispanic community, it doesn't mean I never experienced it. And he didn't want me to identify myself as Hispanic. He wanted me to use a different word that's more politically correct these days. And I didn't want to do that. But I had to research that to put more depth into the dissertation. So I'm learning more about this now than I even did 2 years ago. So for you to ask us to define systemic racism, I think that changed for me now in the last year or two compared to maybe 3, 4, or 5 years ago. I think it exists. I think the more we learn and research with everything going on these days, it's obviously more prevalent. Not to say that this didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago, but it just makes you think more and to be a little more understanding. But when I got out the conversation with the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion, I was almost laughing, not out of disrespect, but out of shock that I was just discriminated against by a minority. And I did not know how to handle that. And I can't wait to have more conversations with that university when I do my research to find out how they're handling maybe systemic racism in their university.
Okay. We have to stop there, but hopefully if this is an engaging conversation, that means when we pick it up next week, hopefully we're getting into it, right? So next week we can, and by the way, you guys are all playing very fair, and that's wonderful. And we were a little nervous about what might happen. And yet, we're going to pick up where we left off next week, but we're going to devote the whole time to this kind of conversation, okay? And with that, Jan, since you've got a mic, you want to close us in prayer?
Absolutely. Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for your great love for us. We thank you that one day all tribes, all nations will bow before you and pronounce Jesus as our Lord and our King. And I pray that you will help us to remember our unity as Christians. I pray that you will give us discernment and kindness and love towards one another as we engage in some very passionate conversations. We don't agree with each other on all these aspects, Lord, but one thing we can agree on, we love you and we want to be your image bearers. I pray for the grace that we may go out into the world and show Jesus to the world, whether we're having these conversations or just interacting in other ways. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your Savior. Amen.